Yo, what is up, everyone? Tons of comments already. Drop in the chat where you are watching from. Let us know you can hear me okay. I'm going to bring Nolly on in just a second. Stoked to see you guys are already excited. So Nolly and I have been like chatting over Facebook Messenger about different videos I put out, and he'll be like, "Oh, I kind of have this opinion," and we'll go back and forth. So it's been fun, and we just decided like we've got to do a live stream or something so that you guys can kind of be a part of a conversation between two different engineers, producers, mixers who have different approaches, but oftentimes a shared end goal or a shared philosophy or mindset. So you guys ready to bring Adam on? Make sure you guys hit the like button, share this out to people. All right, let's go. All right, Adam, what's up, man?
Hey, pleasure to be on, dude. I was looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too, man. It seems like a lot of people have been looking forward to this as well with the comments.
Oh, that's awesome. Pleased to hear it.
Yeah, so, and why don't we just get right into it? So a lot of you guys watching, you might know I published a video a couple weeks ago kind of reviewing or doing a reaction to one of Adam's recent mixes with the new Periphery song. And so, man, I'm just really curious, like, why don't you tell everyone, like, what were you thinking when you watched that mix review? And, like, was I totally out to lunch on stuff? Or, like, what was your reaction?
No, I was genuinely really pleased with so many of the points that you brought up. And for one, it's pretty nerve-wracking, to have someone who's a really great mix engineer kind of listen with a critical ear and kind of throw their opinions out there. I guess, you know, other people maybe would have got something slightly wrong and kind of proclaimed it like a fact. And I really liked how subjective you kept it. But the thing is, you really hit on so many points that were pretty kind of important to me, and it made me feel quite proud of the production as well, and proud of the decisions we made because just really kind of they're not big decisions in terms of the mix, but they do end up kind of having quite a big difference in terms of the feel of the mix. Like just things like not having loads of high end on the kick drum was something you brought up. You were like,
Mm-hmm.
he could have pushed it further, and I had that thought. I was like, I could push the high end further on this, and I didn't on purpose. And like so many of the decisions that you pointed out were ones that we kind of made on purpose, and it really speaks to me to like a wider conversation that we've been having about like the philosophy of mixing. Trying to, we, as you say, we've been kind of chatting on Facebook Messenger and been talking about things like what makes a mix unique, and kind of not trying to completely homogenize everything and make everything sound the same. And just because you could put a bit more top end on the kick doesn't necessarily mean that that's what the production needs.
Mm.
Um, Periphery 5 for me, that was the only record that I worked on last year actually. So I really had the time, and also having worked on loads of prior Periphery records, I had loads of time to kind of think about how things should sound, and knowing the guys in the band really clearly. I kind of my main goal was to make everyone in the band sound like the best version of themselves with their taste taken into account. Matt, big drummer, really muscly guy, hits really hard. For me, I wanted the drums to be more like fat sounding, not like tubby, but I wanted to kind of have something that kind of conveyed that kind of massiveness of Matt playing drums. Um, or the guitar tone's actually really different on all the different tracks, and there's so many conversations that we had within within the chat as we were working on the mix about like, well, I, speaking as myself, prefer guitar tone A, but Misha, this one sounds more like you, so we should use that one, and stuff like that. It was really a lot about kind of giving up control and letting things be a little bit more round, turning the bass up maybe more than I normally would do, actually, which is funny considering that I played the bass on it. I feel like so many of these points you brought up there, and you commented on the room sound on the drums and certain points where I automated them up just for those moments. Or the mid range thing's a big one. You kind of demonstrated what maybe other modern metal mixers might do, and so in terms of like carving away the lower mid range and boosting more top and all of that. As you went through those things, I was like, yeah, and that was on purpose. And you demonstrating the difference to me, it was like, yeah, cool. I'm really pleased with those decisions. So yeah, it
Yeah.
felt really great.
Well, yeah, I was relieved to hear that too, because it's funny you're saying it's nerve wracking on your side. It's also nerve wracking on my side to also be like talking about a mix from someone who I also respect and be like, man, I hope I'm not saying these things and like, he's gonna be bummed about it, or I'm totally wrong about what I'm saying. But yeah, it's pretty interesting how you said about two things that stuck out there. Number one, just having the kick drum not have quite as bright of an attack that you would normally hear in this genre, and then also the lower mid range having that be just a little fatter. And I mentioned in the video, it's like those are what you would typically call the muddy frequencies, but it didn't sound muddy at all. And typically guys would cut those out, and you'd have maybe a little bit cleaner, but you lose some of that power and energy. So you mentioned how that was, both of those things were like conscious decisions. Like why were you thinking that? Like, and how early on in the process did you make those decisions?
Yeah, I think there's an aspect of it which is, to be frank, there's an aspect of like deliberately wanting to sound a little bit different to the others, not making it sound purposefully bad, but being like, I kind of like it if it's not super sculpted out. Um, and then on the other hand, there's also, as I reflect on it, like a lot of my work over the last few years has been working with raw tones, guitar tones, bass tones, drum tones, doing stuff like for my company GTD, or developing doing pretty much all the cab impulses for the neural DSP stuff, the quad cortex, and for our own products. And like I've just spent so long working on raw tones that I kind of got just really into how they sound like that. And I almost kind of coming back to mixing again, I kind of came back with this feeling of like I just don't want to mess with that stuff too much. Like a good source tone, I kind of really appreciate how that sounds and want to do the minimal amount
Hmm.
to make it work within the mix, which actually takes us directly into, I think, a difference between us, which is really interesting. Which, as you say, I kind of watched quite a lot of your videos. I find it insightful, and because you have a different approach, I find it quite intriguing. When I'm up in the middle of the night with with my little one, and nothing better to do, it's like, well, I may as well put an AirPod in and kind of listen to stuff. So, uh, sorry, I digress.
Yeah.
Um, the point I was going to make is, you talk about using boosting as an, boosting EQ moves to generate more excitement than you get if you're just kind of carving away stuff that you don't
Right.
like, and not working in solo, because yeah, that tends to give you this tendency of wanting to just carve away stuff instead of kind of seeing the bigger picture. And I hope I'm representing your view right. I think that's the kind of stuff you say.
Yep. Definitely.
Um, where, for me, like a lot of what I do is about actually working in solo. Um, a lot of it is about kind of reducing the stuff which is clouding up, like it's like kind of uncovering the great tone that's underneath it. And I kind of look at it like, well, your close mic and guitar cab, the stuff being introduced just by having a microphone on that speaker that kind of takes you further away from the real beauty of that guitar tone. So let's just kind of correct for that proximity effect, or
Hmm.
just do a little bit of enhancement just to make it work in the mix. But otherwise, it's like, I always go to cooking analogy. It's like, when you have great ingredients, it's kind of just about doing simple things to them and not overdoing it so that you can really taste or hear the nature of that ingredient. So
Right. So you said you're doing a lot of this stuff in solo in terms of just kind of correcting the imperfections of the sounds.
yeah, yeah, I do. And again, I do think this is an interesting point, and listening to the stuff you said and other mixers say about not working in solo, it definitely kind of makes me reflect on why I do it. And, it's very cool that you liked the outcome when you heard the mix of it. So kind of like,
Right.
okay, so what am I doing that's making that not be a trap for me? And I think the answer is just kind of learning the hard way. Like it's kind of the way I've done it, and overdoing it, notching too much stuff, taking too much stuff out, and kind of learning to have that kind of judicious sense of like, okay, I just know that that's going to be too much. Like kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but like, yeah, just kind of building my sense around just doing it that way so much that I kind of managed to bring it in line with my taste, which would not be to have it kind of too sculpted out.
Yeah. The interesting thing about your mixes is that I would never guess that, because the typical reason it screws people up is because they're in solo. They'll tend to EQ things the same way all the time. Like when I used to mix in solo a
Mm.
lot, I would always suck out the low mids and boost like the high mids and the high end, because almost every single track in the mix in solo, it makes it sound better when you do that. But when you put that all together, your mix has no power, especially kind of in the low mids and the mid range. But yours, like, obviously it doesn't sound like that. Like everything still glues and everything kind of has its place, but it overlaps in the right way too. It's not too separate. So that's pretty unique, man. I don't know if I've talked to anyone else who has said that they are able to mix in solo a lot and then still get to the result that you get to.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. And yeah, I mean, to clarify, I do my EQing a lot in solo. Like I do my
Mm,
processing a lot in solo, but then I'm listening to it in context. And I think the more
mm,
stuff I do, um, the more I think my work is really just about levels. It's just about like balancing levels really carefully, and intuitively. Not saying that it's about like really agonizing. It's just about kind of working relatively quickly when I'm in solo. I guess that's the point. I'm not like there for more than a couple of seconds, really. I hear something that I want to get rid of, and then I'm soloing it to make sure I'm not overdoing the thing that I'm doing or missing something else, which is the actual reason.
right. Okay, so that's like a bit of a clue what you just said. So is it you're listening and you're
Mm.
balancing in context and then you hear something that's bothering you, then you pop into solo and fix it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Beyond just when I initially import tracks, if it's not something I've worked on, I might solo through just to listen for issues, like noise floor issues or something distorting in a minor way that might get brought out later, stuff like that. But yeah, I suppose I'm identifying the issues in context a lot of the time.
Okay.
So maybe that's it.
Well,
Maybe that's
yeah, I
it.
mean that definitely makes sense. That's definitely adds a little bit more context to just saying, "Oh, I'm mixing solo,"
Mm.
like because I think that's yeah, I would totally do that as well. Like, but the point is that yeah, you try to listen to everything in the context of the whole mix, and then if something jumps out, like yeah, you can. The solo button's like the magnifying glass, where you're like, "Oh, I hear something wrong. I'm gonna go hunting and find it." Then you pop back out, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, I guess that is a good point. It's nice to have this conversation. I mean, I can't see all the chat and everything, so as far as I'm concerned, we're just having like a
Yeah.
therapy session basically. And it's like kind of a cool dissection. But I think you're right. I think that is kind of what's going on. And this is what I was saying, prior to us doing this. I think actually we're closer than it seems. If people listen
Yeah.
to the way that we teach or look at the moves we make, then they might think we're further apart than we are.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's so much to dig into there. By the way, everyone who's watching, drop questions in the comments. I'm gonna keep an eye on them, and if I see a good question come up there, we'll definitely bring it up. One of the things that I saw on that periphery video in those comments, some people were commenting on that video and talking about how, hey, Nolly uses like a top-down approach, or he, uses a lot more buses than you do in your mixes. A lot of people who have maybe been in my courses and stuff. Can you talk about that whole top-down thing and what's your approach there?
Yeah, I think it's really important to get into this because I think I've changed a little bit in how I think about it because I always used to talk about it as top down. Um, I tend to think of it more, but let me tell you what it isn't. I'm not setting up all the faders and balancing it and then grabbing a master EQ and moving the stuff around until the whole mix sounds, in my opinion, better, and then moving with that. I have
Hmm.
a set pre-emphasis EQ. Basically, it's almost like a mastering kind of EQ, and it is kind of the thing you're talking about. A bit of, and it's all boosting some low end, boosting some high, like upper mids, up, I guess low treble, and high end. Um, and I don't really ever hear the mix without that on. So it's like it's it's like an Instagram filter on my mix, kind of that just stays there, and then I mix to that. But I say that, but actually, the interesting thing is over time, especially going through that phase where I was describing, where I was just working on raw tones a lot, I've actually trimmed it back. I've pared it back now. So what you hear on the periphery mix, and the other couple of things which I've done in recent times, is that EQ is actually only applied on the drum bus. That's kind of become an essential part of my drum processing,
Hmm.
but I've taken it off the guitars and the bass. The vocals haven't been going through that for a long time. Um, and it just works for me on drums, and it gives me the sound that I'm used to, and I'm used to the kinds of amounts of boost that I'm doing on the microphone signals with that in place. I could mix without it, I guess. I just need to get used to cranking things up a bit more, but it kind of
Sure.
it feels good to me to not be doing these massive top end boosts on individual tracks.
Yeah.
And then I guess the other part would be the like master bus compression or two bus compression. But that's nothing new. I mean, loads of people that aren't top down mixers still have a bus compressor on,
Yeah, for sure.
or and a limiter in my case too. I'll mix into that as well, just so the transients sound right.
How heavily are you hitting that limiter when you're mixing into it?
Yeah. Also, one thing you commented on the wildfire mix was like how pinned the master is, like how kind
Yeah.
of brick wall it is, and I think and how the snare's still cutting through, which is great. And I think a lot of that's credit to Mike Kalajian who mastered it.
Amazing. Yeah.
When I'm mastering, I think I'm more like sorry when I'm mixing, I think that limit is getting me into the ballpark of like somewhere between -12 to -10 laughs, probably closer to -12. So it's not a super loud master. Um, and that's partly because I never look at it, and I don't want to get into a situation where I'm unknowingly really limiting my mix pretty hard. I kind of have my gain staging. It's not scientific, but I know when I'm hitting my mix bus limit, sorry, my mix bus compressors a certain amount, that my gain staging is pretty much the same
Hmm.
as it is on other mixes. So that limiter is kind of set enough to be trimming a fair amount off like the kick and snare transients, but it shouldn't really be touching the rest of the mix unless it's like
Yeah.
a super busy section.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
basically identical to how I work as well. I typically don't put it on until maybe halfway or 2/3 through the mix, but yeah, I'll have it just touching kick and snare a little bit, and it's typically around, yeah, like the -12. So that's interesting. I didn't know
Yeah.
we shared that in common.
Yeah, another point of commonality, isn't it? Yeah, interesting.
We got, I think, a pretty good question here. Brady asks,
Mhm.
Jordan typically prefers delay over reverb. What's Nolly's approach to adding space to sounds?
Yeah, so that's actually a really funny question because I remember reading a forum post from you on the Sneak forum from a decade ago, I guess,
Yeah,
maybe,
more than that
where
probably.
you made that exact point long before you had a YouTube channel.
Hmm.
And you made that point of like pro mixers don't really use reverb on stuff. And it's still something that's stuck in my mind. And it is something that I don't live by. I do use reverbs. I use them more for a sense of like real space.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, for the most part, I like lead guitars, vocals. I'll tend to really lean on delay a lot more, unless, as I think you do as well, there's like you want a spaced out kind of vibe, like not a real sounding space, like a really long shimmery reverb on something. Or um, so yeah, that's the case, and I do find when clients request, "Oh, can I have more reverb on the guitar?" and they're insistent about it. I get it to a point where they're happy, but I generally think it sounded better before there was reverb on there. I'd rather turn the delay up more. Reverb, yeah, it just kind of clouds stuff up, isn't it? Doesn't it? Like the delay just works better for me most of the time.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, eh? Like, why is it that delay just sounds so much cleaner? Like, it doesn't. You can have so much delay going on, but it just. I don't know if it's because it's usually synced to the BPM of the song. That's probably a big factor of it, but it just seems to really do a good job of creating depth without clouding the mix the way reverb does.
I mean, I guess intuitively, if delay is just a whole load of sorry, if reverb's just a whole load of delays happening simultaneously, it's like ultra dense
True.
set of delays happening continuously, right? So I guess it makes sense that it would take up more sonic space. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think the sync thing does a lot as well. Yeah.
All right, we got another good one here. Nolly, is your secret to being able to use only live recorded drum tracks? Is it mic positioning, or do you rely heavily on processing, or is it the drum room?
I think it's all of the above plus the drummer. The drummer himself is a really big part. And, I do want to go on record and say most of the time I'm using some kick sample. Um, but, like the periphery record, that has kick sample on there. But the snare and the toms don't. And yeah, that's everything combined, including, like I mentioned, Matt's a really big guy. His arm span is huge. That naturally gives you quite good mic separation.
Mm,
We used a smaller kit this time in terms of number of cymbals, and that again means there's more space to be able to get clean mic signals. Using really specific microphones, I've shared with you, like the snare top track, um,
that's right.
using one of those Neumann mics. It's like a handheld condenser mic. that's meant for live vocals that Peter Miles at Middle Farm Studio tried and turned me on to, and I think is recommended to quite a few people. And it works amazingly well. Like prior to that, I would use the Beta 57. I still use that sometimes, but that Neumann mic is like the noise floor is, well, like the bleed is so minimal compared to the signal. So you use that, and then you use something like, in the past I've used FabFilter Pro MB, the multi-band. I guess it's a trick that kind of got associated with me after the Creative live stream. And these days, actually, I don't do that. I just use FabFilter Saturn 2, but you can do it in the original Saturn 2, which the original Saturn 1, 2,
Yeah.
uh, where you just make a band for like the upper mid frequencies and up, and then there's just like a dynamics knob, and you turn that down, and that basically just does the same thing of making the high frequencies a lot shorter. And yeah, I've done that for a few drum mixes. Like I do, sorry, like streaming mixes. Like I did a mix for my friend Craig Reynolds from the Downbeat. He's got a really popular drum stream that he does. And I needed to set him up a template that didn't have gates, so that you can hit lots of different volumes, and he's not just going to like lose a floor tom or whatever because it's not triggering the gate. And I just leave them all open, but with FabFilter Saturn on there, and on the kick and the snare, I think it's on all the shells. And yeah, you don't even really need gates when you do that. So yeah, I think it's all of the above.
Yeah, you sent me actually a couple of the tracks, the snare top track from that Periphery record, right?
I think so. Yeah,
Do you mind if I play it here?
go for it if you can. Yeah.
Okay, let me know, you guys, if this comes through. Okay, so that was the raw snare top track, and then this is the one that was processed with that Saturn trick you just mentioned. So I'll play them both back to back again. You can hear, this is the raw one. You can hear the cymbal bleed. Now listen to the cymbals. Yeah, it's pretty awesome how you still get the snare almost sounds exactly the same. It's just you're taming all that cymbal bleed, which is, I was happy you explained that trick to me, because that was also one of the things I said in that video. Is like, man, he said he didn't use a snare sample here, but you don't hear what you typically hear of like the like opening of the gate with the snare hits. So that's pretty good. I've actually
Yeah,
never
which is
done
just the
that on
worst.
snare. Yeah, I do something similar on toms. I just use like duplicated tracks to do it because I don't have that plugin. But
Mm.
yeah, it's pretty cool to hear that.
You can do it quite a few ways. I think I first got the idea. Well, it first came about on the Periphery Juggernaut record because there was just so much bleed on the snare top, and I was just
Mm.
reaching for any fix, and that was like, wow, that actually works. It still is a bit audible, and I don't really rate that mix at all. There's quite a few things I think I could have done differently that would have helped, but um, I should correct actually that snare track is from the Bleed from Within record that I did, but that's the same microphone in the same drum room.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I guess I just sent you that because I had it closer to hand. Um, and yeah, the final thing would be that's just the snare top, but you put the snare bottom with that, which of course is giving you more of that top end kind of, psh, and that's not having that processing on it. And then it's like, yeah, you don't notice any change at all to the snare tone.
Yeah.
You just hear the cymbals basically disappear.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are some other things you've noticed from watching my videos in terms of things that you're like, oh wow, I do that a lot differently?
Um, yeah, let me think. I mean, so something which sometimes surprises me is how much about what I do is how much snare compression I need to use versus other people. Like I'm, I've got generally like upwards of 10 or 12 dB of snare, like compression on my snare bus. Um, Quite often, yeah, 12 to 14 even. And
Okay.
I don't see many other people doing that. Like I see so many people being like, yeah, you just kiss it with a compressor, give it like 2 or 3 dB of reduction, and
Mm.
that's enough. And that's something, if I remember correctly, I feel like your moves tend to actually be a bit more subtle, like less compression and less saturation afterwards, where I'm compressing harder and then saturating harder afterwards. And I guess I'm
Hmm.
interested to know if you could, because of bleed not being an issue, would you be compressing harder, or is that just not the sound that you're after?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my snare sound will come from the parallel compression bus, and I'll obviously have a lot less like cymbals and stuff in that bus. And I'm mostly trying to get the snare sound out of that. Um, but yeah, totally. Like, there's been so many times where I am relying on a sample more because I can't get as much intensity and attack as I want out of the raw snare because of the bleed.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I always think, and I always thought your snare sounded great. Like, I still do, but I mean, like, for a long time, I thought your snare sounded great. And there's so many other people too, like Andy Sneap and lots of, CLA, you watch his tutorials, and it's like he's using really low ratios, and the needle's just moving a little bit and comes out sounding one way. And when I try and replicate that in my mixes, like, which is what I used to try and do, it just didn't work for me, you know? So I think it's really interesting. That's one of those things where I hear other mixers and I listen to other mixers talking about what they do, and I'm like, oh, just can't make that work for me. But when they do it, it sounds really good. So I guess that would be one example of that.
That's
Um,
Yeah, it's funny because I've heard other people, just whether students in my course or whatever, they'll be like, "Oh, did you check out this video with Nolly doing snare? He does it a lot differently than you." And I'll watch it and I'll be like, "Oh, like I love his snare sound, so I'm gonna try and do this." And then I'll try it and it like I can't get it to sound right. So it's funny how we just like I don't know certain things like even though you see someone else do something, even if you copy it, doesn't always end up the same. But you're also treating everything as one, right? Like let's say if you had a snare top, bottom, sample, is that all going to a bus and most of your processing is there? Or am I wrong about that?
yeah, yeah, no, you're right. Most of it. And again, I think that's something that with time I'm doing perhaps a little bit more on the individual channels than I used to, but still not a huge amount. Just
Okay.
actually, I think something which I do more than I used to is kind of shape the sound of the snare bottom. I
Mm-hmm.
used to tend to leave it pretty raw and just kind of blend it in, and then it would end up quite quiet in the mix. And that was kind of something which I wanted to have sounding better in my mixes, like have more snare bottom in there, but not have it sound too like ratty or kind of just kind of rubbish, basically. So I
Yeah.
think I've been doing a bit more like quite savage EQing sometimes, like really like a big boost, or here you go, big boost at like 5K or something like that.
Yeah.
Sometimes on if I've used a condenser or something that doesn't have as much of that, and then other times kind of the opposite, like kind of scooping out some of those upper mid-range frequencies just so it sounds a bit more balanced.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I do like that approach. But yeah, compressing all of those things together does also have the effect of like lowering the perception of the snare bottom track, let's say. You know what I mean? Like if
Mm-hmm.
the traditional setup, you're like compressing the snare top and the snare bottom's kind of much more consistent as a sound, just kind of like a white noise almost, then, that's one sound. But with me, when that's going to a compression, it's like they're both getting ducked down together after the transient. So I think that's probably quite a big part of how my like close mic snare sound comes out. I think so. That's something which I'm kind of at this point. It's like, well, that's my sound. I like it. Other people recognize it, so that's I'm going to keep doing it.
Sure. While we're talking about drums, another video I posted, which got a lot of negative comments, which I totally expected, and was saying that you should always quantize the drums. And I'm interested to hear your opinion on that one.
Yeah, we had a bit of kind of a back channel chat about that one, didn't it? Before you
Yeah.
posted it, you were like, "This one's going to get loads of hate." And, yeah, it's
Yeah.
definitely getting some kind of divisive comments, isn't it? I think.
Yeah.
Oh, it's really interesting. I think there's so many different things at play, including ego here of the drummer specifically, but also sometimes of the engineer, or like the engineer not necessarily wanting to take the time, which I think is why the drummers can get so kind of ruffled feathers over it, where they feel like they're just not being given a chance.
Mm.
But I think the truth is, in the genres that we work in, almost all of the time, the drummer is aiming for the grid. Do you know what I mean? That's literally what they're trying to do. They're trying to play
Right.
on the grid.
Right.
So putting it on the grid is not going to ruin it, which is what
Hmm.
you say in the video. And I think that's an important distinction. You're not necessarily saying it sounds bad if you don't, if it's a really good drummer,
Yeah.
but you're not going to kill it if you do put it on the grid.
Right.
Um, I think we spoke a little bit like over our messages of like we've both had experiences of working with amazing drummers, especially that have lots of experience in other genres, where maybe stuff isn't done to a click, or there's a huge emphasis put on feel and flow. Or, when I worked with Matt Gartzko on the first Animals as Leaders record that he drummed on, like the notes that were coming back, because I didn't edit the drums on that, that was getting edited by Jeff Dunn, and sent back, and there were certain fills that Jeff was just, it was like pretty much sounds like a straight triplet fill or whatever. And Garsk would be like, no, 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 that's supposed to be like a slightly dragged quintuplet and then this other thing. And it was like a really subtle difference. And he was playing it exactly the way he intended it to sound. And so it's like when you're dealing with someone like that who is just like savant level subdivision down to the quantum level, it's like fair enough. You're aiming for something that is not the grid, and you've had the foresight to play it that way and the intention, so that should be left that way. And it is kind of, if it doesn't sound bad, is kind of criminal to quantize it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, like I felt like there was an example in your own thing of like Gavin Harrison, great drummer, great feel, and his tracks were basically on the grid. So it's like, what's that telling you? Is the lesson that being that far off the grid is where all the soul is, or is it that
Right.
he was aiming for the grid?
Right. Yeah, I think that's the main point, is like I was trying to make in that video, is that even with an amazing drummer, when we quantize it, it doesn't ruin it. Like it doesn't ruin the song. Like it still feels great because there's so many other elements with dynamics and even the parts they're playing that come into the whole conversation of feel. It's not just, the timing. But
Yeah,
yeah,
I think the
I'm curious.
dynamics is really important, actually. I think, because I do a lot of stuff with program drums with GGD, and I hear a lot of the way people use our drums. Even just when I'm programming drums, I will program on the grid and then I'll use just a random humanize, like just offsetting things ever so slightly. And
Mhm.
that makes a really big difference in that context. Um, and I think it's to do with the dynamics being that much more level because of the way the sampling is. Things sound really consistent. When you really look at waveforms of pro drummers, they are not as consistent. I mean, they're really
Sure.
consistent, but there's more variation than people typically program in.
Hmm.
Um, and I kind of feel, I was thinking about this when I was walking the dog. I kind of feel like there's three aspects here. There's like timing, there is how like not dynamic something's being played, and then there's like how much samples being used. And I feel like if it's being played really undynamically, it's not on the grid and you're using samples, that's just like the worst case scenario. But like, you know what I mean? If something's
Yeah.
being played dynamically and gridded, I think that sounds way more real than
Mhm.
something which is being left off the grid but has had like, I'm talking about kind of one shot samples or evident samples that are kind of taking away from the dynamics. I
Mhm.
feel like that sounds way more fake
Yeah.
than a gridded performance with completely natural drums. So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know, maybe I'm rambling here.
No, I totally get that. I agree with that. Even with in that conversation, we also talked about how even just listening to the drummer play and what are their strengths and weaknesses, and noticing if they're sloppy on certain things, like how that's going to influence the approach that you take recording. It definitely does for me. And just along the lines of what you're saying, like if there's definitely times where, let's say the drummer, I'm trying to get them to hit harder or be more consistent dynamically, but it's like that. I'd rather take that take with better dynamics and a little bit sloppier timing. I'd be like, I'm definitely using that one, and I'll just fix the timing, because it's way harder to fix the sloppy dynamics after. And like you said, you'll end up relying more on samples, and then everything just kind of takes a downhill turn when you do that. So yeah, it's kind of similar with vocals. Like I'd rather use a take that has great feel and great timing, and I can fix the pitch a little bit. That's easy, but I'd rather take that one. So yeah, it's
100%. I think that's a really good point. I think it's a really good point. And the other thing that we described as well is there is a kind of gray, or there is like an in between, which is not quantizing every single hit, by which I mean leave the kicks and the snares on the grid.
mhm,
But, if there's a more open space where there's constant eighths on the hat being played, maybe don't grid all of the kind of the upbeats
Right.
Because a great drummer, again, I refer to Matt Halpin, who's got like a great flow and a great swing. Um, and a lot of that feel is in those kind of in between the strong beats. It's actually like, the second hit might be slightly early, actually, which is creating this sensation of space before the next downbeat.
Mm.
And that comes out sounding really real. Even if you line up the kicks and snares on the grid, you can leave a bit of human feel in there, or in fills or in flams, stuff like that. Like you can pick your battles and kind of leave certain things which allow the drummer's identity to come through. Because I guess that's the point where drummers take umbrance, right? Is when they feel like their identity is being squashed. But I think you have to have a great identity in your sound as a drummer for that to be worthwhile. Because if you're not that great, you're going to sound way better on the grid.
Yeah, exactly. I think the threshold is just like when you say like someone being a great drummer, like to me, I don't know what you would say the percentage of drummers that you've worked with that you legitimately could be like, okay, if I don't put this on the grid, it actually sounds just as good as if it was on the grid. Like to me, that's like I can honestly think of maybe two drummers over like a 15-year period that I've had that experience with. I don't, maybe you've had more, but I think that's, a lot of people say, oh, a great drummer doesn't need to be quantized. It's like, yeah, I agree. But like the sample size of those great drummers is like very, very small in my experience.
It depends. I do come down to like I think especially with time, I kind of come down to this feeling of like we are actually recording like the work of human beings, and like if there are places where I can allow some of the real performance to come through, even if it's like 95% as good as the quantized version, or I don't know, like even if there's certain things which are bothersome in the moment when you're editing,
Mm,
one, I generally find that by the time you get to mixing, they're completely unnoticeable.
that's
And
true.
two, I hear them and I'm like, I feel the same thing about, making the drum room audible or on the fills and stuff like that. It's like, yeah, Matt Halpin sat in that room, which is a really old kind of mill, and I was sitting in the same room with him actually when we tracked. That's like a one room studio. And I felt the SPL of all of that rebounding off the walls, and like we moved atoms in that space, and that's something which was recorded, and I kind of want that to be represented on the record.
Mm,
And it sounds so just so stupid to say out loud, but there is an element of like it's kind of cool if you can hear a little bit of the identity of that person, so that that lives forever on the record. But
yep,
again, needs to be really damn close.
for sure.
You needs
Yeah,
to feel like you're in the presence of something really awesome happening to want to do that. I think otherwise it's like, yeah, the mission is like polish this so that it sounds great.
right. Speaking of drum rooms, this is another track you sent me. This is actually from the Periphery room sound, I think. So I'll play this for you guys. This is the room track. Nice. Yeah, that's awesome. I would love to work with that.
Yeah, it's a killer sounding room, that one. And you commented on like how much low end there is.
Hmm.
And then I was saying the room mics are up on a balcony or like a mezzanine level at least. And you don't necessarily get the sense just hearing that. You kind of feel like it's low, maybe. And we
Yeah.
were talking about, you watch loads of YouTube videos, especially like rock guys, and they're like, yeah, get the mics low so that you avoid the cymbals. And I just think that's completely not true. And you were saying the same thing. I just think I'm not saying that that wouldn't work, but it's much more about like where in the room you are, because like we were talking about with reverb, you've got like these sounds ringing off all of the surfaces and coming back, and at certain points they're kind of creating like a constructive phase where the low end sounds really big, and that could be quite high, it could be quite low, it can be close, it can be far, and the trick is to find those spots just with your body and your ears. You can feel the pressure, and you
Yeah.
can hear the low end, and you put the microphones there, and it sounds big, even if it's really far away, even if it's high up. High doesn't mean cymbals, and that's
Right.
something which that room has really driven home to me. Like mics can go up on the mezzanine, and you can get like a really huge shell sound. And in the sessions I've done there, I've experimented with mics all over the place, but that back wall behind the drummer up on the mezzanine just sounds so good.
Yeah, it's man, it's funny you say that because I you showed me like the picture of that place, and I would say if I was there, I probably wouldn't have guessed that that's like up high, way up there is where you would get that thick sound. Like you just, it just goes to show the importance of experimentation, right?
Yeah. And well, the first time I went there, if I should say, I really like stereo room mics. I'm not much of a fan of mono room mics.
Right.
Typically, when I'm first in a studio for the first time, there's always like this temptation of, oh, we'll just throw like an extra mic up there and see what it sounds like in the mix. And I basically did that with the back wall. I put like a mic on the up on that mezzanine as like kind of just an interesting mono mic. And I put my main stereo pair on the other side, like kind of in front of the kit, up on the walkway still. But um, later, I listened to that mono mic and I was like, "What is going on? Why does that sound so great? Was I just really lucky?" So the next time I went into the studio, I experimented more, put a stereo pair up there, and I was like, "Right, that's it. That's that's the sound. You know, that's where my room mic's going to go from now on."
Yeah. And you mentioned how you also place the drum kit itself wherever the snare has the most low end, right?
Yeah, I don't spend a huge amount of time placing the kit in the room. Usually, I find that, especially if you're working in a place like a busy studio with good engineers, pretty much where they set up the drums, more or less, is going to be a good
Yeah.
spot. That's they've pretty much figured out. And also, it's yeah, just about having like a good placement within the room, just for the ease of work, like the ergonomics of it, not being super far away or whatever. But yeah, within that kind of typical space that the drum kit goes down, I'll experiment with moving a little bit around. Um, because yeah, you can get like a bit of extra kind of low end power that you'll perceive a lot in the overheads. I find I don't know about you, but I don't really notice much difference in the close mics. They're so close,
Sure.
the
Yeah.
signal is so much louder than the reflections. But for me, yeah, it's about the room mics, and I'll just walk around listening with headphones on, like not plugged in, just protecting my ears or whatever, and have the drummer hit the snare drum, not even particularly hard, just and you'll just it jumps out right away when you get into like a magic spot. Probably looks really stupid, me kind of doing all of this and like crouching down, and
Yeah.
but that's the way I do it, and a lot of other engineers I speak to that I think get really good drum room sounds do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. And sometimes you have to get weird with it. I've definitely been in studios where the room, just being in the room, it doesn't even really sound special at all. So I've literally been like setting up stereo mics in hallways, and I'll be standing there and like, okay, I'm gonna have the door like 6 inches open. Okay, what about like 2 inches open? Or what about, and just trying to find that exact sweet spot. And once you get it, okay, don't touch it.
Yeah, no, I think
Yeah.
hallway mics have been a savior for me on a few sessions, but
Mhm.
I don't know about you, but I find I'd rather have a really good sounding room and have the mics in the same room for the stereo image more than anything. You know what
Mhm.
I mean? Like hallway
Yep.
mics, especially if they're stereo, can end up really weird, symbols just everywhere, and
Yeah.
they can be cool for sampling, I find, and less cool in the actual session. But that said, some studios, just have the magic hallway or
Yeah.
like a closet or something that just has that sound.
Yeah.
Um, so
I think this is a really interesting question we got. So it didn't have a name, but it said, do you ever get anxiety before starting a mix?
no, I think I get anxiety more like at the end of no. I'm trying to think when it is, but not at the beginning. I'm generally really excited at the beginning. It's like a world of opportunity, and especially if you've kind of been building up to it, talking to the client, um, you like the music. Hopefully, you've taken on a job where you actually like the music and you feel good about it. Before it comes in, it's this unknown that has so much potential, and I'm really excited to dig into it. Usually, by the end of my first mess around with it, unless there's like issues with the recording, I feel really good about it, far too good about it. Because I'll be comparing and be like, oh my god, my low end's so much bigger than that. Like I used to think they had loads of low end, but mine's got loads more. And I know now that that's a red flag. If your reference for low end sounds small, then there's probably an issue with your mix. Um, but yeah, the anxiety tends to set in after that kind of honeymoon period. I don't know about you, but
Mm,
mixing a record, probably beyond about song three, it starts to sound pretty normal, and the excitement level isn't super high. And if it drags on, and if the revisions process is brutal,
yeah.
it can be really difficult to kind of hear the mix in that excitable way again until pretty much after it's complete and you come back to it in the future. I think that's one of
Yeah.
the biggest things that I struggle with psychologically. I don't know about you.
Yeah, it's definitely gotten less over time. I'd say these days if I'm mixing something, similarly, I'm more excited at the start of it, and then I've like let's say just within the process of one song, I might get like halfway through or something, and usually I'll be feeling like pretty good about it. Be like, all right, this like yeah, this is sounding awesome, and then I'll go and I'll like throw on a reference, and I'm like, oh crap, I'm so far away, like this is terrible. Like, but of course the reference like helps me get back in the right direction, right? And I very quickly realize what's lacking. So it's usually like yeah, this high of excitement, and then a little bit of a valley of like, what am I doing? This is the last mix I'll ever do. And then finally by the end, it's like, I'd say most of the time these days, I'm pretty confident with it in the end. I'm usually not feeling too nervous about what feedback's going to happen or whatever. But definitely in the past, I had similar experiences where so many records I did were like, as soon as I finished them and it was off to mastering, I was just like super insecure about the mix, like thinking, man, I don't know if this is any good. Like, this sucks. I wish I could change this and this and that. But the deadline's passed. And it was only like 3 or 6 months after the record is finally out, which is probably like a year after you actually mixed it. Then you listen to it and it's like, oh, actually, it's okay. It's not that bad, right? Still a lot of things. I still have a lot of
Yeah,
records that I would wish I could change something, but that's also part of the journey, right?
yeah, for sure. And I wanted to talk actually because I feel like this is an appropriate time. I wanted to talk about. I know you have like quite a specific set of steps that you go through when you mix,
Mm-hmm.
um, so that you kind of know when you're done. And I feel like I might have kind of developed a good sense of it myself, but I don't have it as formal as that. And I feel like genuinely it could be helpful for me to hear your,
Yeah.
like, do you, what I'm imagining you're going to say is that you kind of do certain passes where you're only looking out for certain things and ignoring other things because you've got the next pass where you're going to focus on that thing. Whereas I feel like I go through pretty haphazardly, and it's
Mm.
kind of just gradually through listening plenty of times and making haphazard tweaks that I end up where I'm happy.
Yeah. So I definitely did kind of get down to a repeatable process. A lot of it is about the front end stuff. So just the organizing of tracks, um, the routing, stuff like that. Like in the past, I would be kind of haphazard even with that. Like I just would get some tracks and I would start. You'd just be excited about it. So you throw some tracks into the DAW, and then you hear something, and then you start immediately fixing problems. But like everything's still all over the place. There's still four tracks that are named Audio 1, Audio 23, like whatever. And I found that really slowed me down later on because I'd be searching for things, be like, where is this sound coming from? And I'm trying to find it. So anyway, yeah, the first step in my process is just like literally from naming all the tracks. Like I will go through and I'll name every single track the exact same way. And for me, that's like the kick drum is named kick, all in caps, and then the snare is like SN top and SN bottom, and it's like always the exact same naming structure. And I put them in the exact same order on the screen um, before I really even care to listen to anything. Sometimes I'll put that on the rough mix or something as a reference while I'm doing that. So yeah, naming and organizing, and then I'll set up all the buses and routing, which these days is just with a template. Like I'll just bring in my mixing template, and because all my track names are all the same, it just automatically maps to that, and then puts all the outputs and all the buses so that everything's created there. All my effects are there. A lot of the plugin change that I typically go to on, the core tracks of a mix, they're already kind of loaded up there. Um, so yeah, that's like the first couple steps, and then from there I do just like a rough balance and panning, just trying to get the feel for the song, listen to it a couple times. Then I go to what I call the heavy lifting. So that's where I'm actually like doing all the heavy lifting, all the processing, the EQ, the compression. But I even do that in a certain order. Like I'll always start with the drums. I'll try to get the drum sounding big. Then I'll do the bass, the rhythm guitars. I'll kind of have the vocal in and out throughout that process because I don't want to totally ignore that. But I'll really just try to get the drums, bass, and guitars and like lead vocal, just those core elements, like get those sounding good. Then bring in like lead guitars, layers, background vocals, and then of course once you kind of get the basic mix, then you do kind of jump back and forth because you think, oh, the bass needs more low end, and then that affects the kick or something else about the drums. So you bounce back and forth. But yeah, after the heavy lifting, then I'll go in and do automation. And that's definitely a stage where, like what you're saying, is I'll be doing something while thinking I know I'm going to deal with this later. So as I'm automating the drums, I usually start with the drums. I always start with the overheads, actually. Automating the overhead mics to make sure the cymbal is a consistent level throughout the song, and that the big crashes and downbeats pop up a little more. Or if it's just riding on a crash, I bring that down a little bit, so it's not overbearing. That's always the first thing, because it kind of, I don't know why, it wasn't on purpose. It just ended up that way. That was always the thing that was making my mix sound weird, and I wanted to almost like solve that problem right away at the automation phase, because it gives me like a steady high-end energy. It kind of nails that down for the whole song, right? Then I'll automate like the rest of the
But
drums, kicks in.
not to get too far off track here, but have you experimented with just compressing your overheads a lot?
Yeah, I do that
Like
more
maybe
now
low
than I
mix
used
or
to.
whatever?
Yeah, I do it more now than I used to, but I still don't do a ton. Like usually my compression on overhead tracks is kind of just ducking the snare, and then the odd like loud crash hit, it would hit the compressor a little bit. But are you doing more than that?
I do quite a lot these days, yeah. But with a mix set note. So like getting quite crushed and then mix down at like 30% or something.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's kind of filling in space, makes all the cymbals sound kind of glossy, and yeah, it gives that consistent high end.
What kind
Um,
of compressor?
I like to use FabFilter Pro C2 for that because it's quite, um, yeah, it's got I forget which mode I use, but it's a really good Swiss Army knife, and the more I use it, the more I realize it can kind of do everything.
Hmm. Okay.
I really like that for that, because I also mess around with the pre-emphasis as well to make sure it's not catching too much snare. Instead of kind of limiting it, I might just set the high pass filter in the sidechain really high. So I mean, he still is going to catch the high end of the snare.
Yeah, that's interesting. One of the plugins we developed with Black Salt Audio was uh, called Oxygen. It under the hood, it does almost a similar thing where it creates a parallel track and then filters out, so it's only just the high end, and then there's some other processing going on there, but you can compress that high end specifically, which is kind of just streamlining a trick that I used to do for kind of problem overhead tracks where it was all kit and no cymbals. And yeah, so it's interesting. It sounds like almost a similar problem solving approach there.
I want to get back to your automation thing, but I just want to say I don't know if I've ever been sent an overhead track that has too little cymbals in it.
Seriously?
I
Oh
think
man.
I think maybe I just work with drummers that have like really big kits with loads of cymbals, and I mean, I guess the
Did it?
worst I've had like cymbals that sound really dull, but in terms of just like straight up volume, that hasn't really happened very much. But anyway,
You haven't had
please tell me
you
more about
haven't
your automation after you do the drums.
Yeah, no, it's the tracks it's the overhead tracks where you can literally look at the transients, and it's like it looks like a close mic almost, that like the snare and the kick transients are so loud in the overheads, and there's like nothing in between. Like they've mic'd it super far away from the cymbals or something like that, so that when you try to turn
All
up to
right.
get like more cymbal, you just get more crappy overhead sound of the kit, right?
Wow. Okay. I think I'm gonna have to send you an overhead track in mine so you can roast it, because I don't know. I get quite a lot of snare transient in my, especially snare in my overheads, but I don't know if it's close to what you're talking about. So that will be
Okay.
one for the future.
Okay. I'd like to check that. Yeah, well, so the automation part, yeah, I do the drums first, starting with the overheads, and then I'll just go through. I'll do like bass and guitars together, and I'll work in like a section, like verse, chorus. But even as that's happening, like there's other elements. Like I know there's a piano over here. Like, oh, I know that I'm covering that up right now, but I'll get to that later. Obviously, the vocals, I do that last in terms of automation, just to make sure it's sitting nicely on top. Um, but yeah, after automation, the only other thing I would do is like special effects. We talked about this too, actually, how can go down a rabbit hole with special effects, and that's why I purposely started doing that almost last in my workflow. It was pretty much as last, where if we want like, I don't know, an underwater sound on the vocal or the drums, or like some crazy reverb delay effect or on something, like I'll save that to the very end, because I know that there's a chance that that's just going to end up me like scrolling through presets for like 45 minutes, and you kind of get lost in that a little bit, and I don't want that to happen like early in my mix. I want to focus on the stuff that's more important. So that's kind of the second last step. And then the last step is just, I just call it like finalizing, which is the final listen through, where I'll just turn the screen off or put a screensaver on, and I'll just listen to it start to finish. Sometimes I'll just have a pen and a notepad next to me where I don't really want to stop it. I just want to like listen to it all the way through, make a note about, verse one, vocal automation's a little off, or, oh, that snare reverb effect that I put in the bridge, now that I listen to the whole song in context, actually sounds kind of stupid. So let me look into that again. Then I just make those notes, go change, and I'll do it again. I'll listen to the whole song again. And by the time I get to the point where I can listen to the whole song without any notes written down, it's like, okay, cool. It's done. So that's basically the workflow.
Yeah. I think it's very cool. I think that last step, yeah, I think that's very interesting. I tend to do that not on my computer, or I tend to do it like I'll leave it real time bouncing and kind of just do other stuff and listen for stuff that catches my ear, and then listen to the mix around the house a little bit. Like I think I have a tendency these days to bounce a little bit sooner with the idea of picking out issues when I'm not mixing, if that makes sense. Which sounds a bit counterintuitive, but like, getting it to a place where I think it's pretty good, bouncing it and then listening to it out and about, making my
Mm.
notes then coming back and having a really focused kind of, almost like I was a band member giving revisions, and then, dealing with it, split personality wise as a mixer again.
Right.
And I think that's something which I didn't do enough of before. So I think what you're talking about, I can see the value in that and how that really helps get close, especially with the Periphery record. Actually, like we had a Google Doc, and I was contributing just as many mix revisions as the band was, and
Mm.
everything was, we were just like a little spreadsheet basically going like an Excel thing, and it said who'd requested the change, and I felt like my name was cropping up quite a lot there. So like, I wouldn't necessarily do that with every client. That's obviously a band that I was in. I know them really well. There's less of that, like trying to maintain a professional distance. Well, I don't know if I'm describing it right, but anyway, it felt a lot more like a collaborative experience, and I really enjoyed that actually. So I think for sure that aspect of making notes on playback is something which I'm going to try and do a lot more of, and I can see the benefit in what you're describing.
Right.
And to clarify too, I think I do actually have quite a structured way of starting mix, a bit like you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
naming, bussing, and I think maybe we are both talking about the same thing, about that kind of middle section of just feeling it out.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting how a lot of these topics, it kind of seems like on the surface, it's like, oh, wait, like we're coming at this totally different. And then there's like a little discussion. It's like, oh, yeah, like now I get what you're saying. We actually are pretty close.
Yeah, 100%. You've called this like me roasting your mix techniques. I think it's pretty much the opposite of that, right?
Well, we had to get people watching, right? Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
just scrolling through comments here to see what kind of questions we got. Yeah, someone asked about like if we use each other's plugins and stuff. I don't know if I've sent you any of mine, but yeah, I've definitely used like the Getgood drums on a couple projects, and
Yeah, that's cool.
the yeah the archetype Nolly, that plugin you did is like, I love it. It's just perfect for me because my favorite amps in the studio are the 5150 and the JCM 800, and you've got those sounds kind of in that plugin. It's just like, I think it's an amazing plugin. It's still the amp sim that I always reach for. But that's also
That's great.
another
It's very cool to
top.
hear.
Yeah, it's another topic that's kind of interesting. Like, I remember a couple of years ago, actually, what happened. I don't know if it was when we made a video talking about that plugin or something, and then you kind of asked me like, oh, like what 5150 do you have, and what speakers are in your Mesa cab, and you're asking for me like the serial numbers, and I didn't have it anymore, but you're like, oh, if you knew the serial numbers, I could figure this out. And that's something that I think we do differ in, where with amps and stuff, I am a guitar player, but with guitar amps and stuff, I'm kind of just like, I almost don't care about messing around with all the impulse responses and all the different cabs. It's like, I get companies send me like emails like, hey, can you feature this cab IR pack on your channel? I'm like, I've like literally never used one. I just like whatever the cab is in the plugin, it's like either it sounds good or it doesn't. I just pull it up and it's just like, do I like this tone? Yes. Okay, let's go. But you're like you get really deep into that stuff, right?
Yeah, I just hate. I guess I like I kind of, I guess I have a bit of like a scientific approach to things. I don't mean that I'm as rigorous as scientists are, but I really believe in the idea of like information being verifiable by other people. Like other people should be able to get the same results if they follow the steps that you set out. And I feel like that's something which has hampered my progress time and time again as I was learning to get into production. Is people would say X, you would do X, and it doesn't come out sounding like like the results that they get.
Mm.
And I think that's frustrating. And I don't think that they're being deliberately, obscuring the truth. But especially like the thing with I mean, it's such an overdone thing, a 5150 with a Mesa Boogie cab, boosted with a tube screamer, of course, and a SM57 on it. And like, it should be the easiest sound in the world to copy. And, the character of 5150 shines through pretty much whatever you do with it. But that, like, the speaker sound for me is so crucial. Like, it's kind of defining that EQ curve, the exact kind of top end, the way the fizz is kind of cancelled out, the way it has like just the right kind of angry gnarliness to it. Like that's all coming from the speaker cab for me, and I just couldn't replicate it with what people said they were using, and that just sent me bananas basically. And like, especially during lockdown, I just went crazy collecting up Mesa cabs, and then I kind of started to realize, wait, like this one's really close to the sound I'm looking for. It's not quite, but this other one's kind of on the other side. It's like too dark, and then was looking at like the date codes on the speaker, and then yeah, just one thing led to another, and it started being like, okay, they've got really good guitar tones, they're using that. Let's find out what the date on their speakers are. And yeah, it turned out there was like a correlation to how basically the vintage 30s changed in voicing over time. And yeah, the people like Andy Sneap is always someone I come back to. Um, like he got these tones with a Mesa Boogie oversized cab that are pretty legendary. And once I got a cab that was basically adjacent serial number to his, it was like, there's the sound. And the reason why it was so frustrating to me is because there's so many like tips and tricks out there, like, oh, you should use this microphone, or you should do this trick, you should do that thing. And then you see guys like Andy Sneap who are like, no, you just put an S57 where the cap meets the cone and it should sound really good, basically. And that
Right.
wasn't working for me. And I was resorting to tricks and it just felt convoluted and I wasn't getting the results I want. So
Yeah.
that's where that kind of like, all right, I'm just going to get to the crux of it. And before that, it happened with amps. Like I was just I'm looking at a stack of amps here, by the way, for context. There are like all these amps that are supposed to be the best high gain amp ever, and you try them, and it's like, yeah, it doesn't sound as good as a 5150 does. And so I just was like, okay, I'm just going to have to learn to read the schematics so that I can see what's going on. And then I started like messing around with the amps and like basically making them into 5150s in the ways that was possible, changing the tone stack and the filtering. And it's like, oh, okay, if you do this, that gives you the cool 5150 sound. So I ended up with like a whole collection of amps that sounded very much like 5150s. So gradually started putting them back again. But I kind of needed to go through that process of figuring out like what is the thing that's really making the difference here. And
Mm.
then that kind of cures the itch at that point because it's like, oh, okay, now I get it. And
Right.
now I love amps that aren't like the 5150, or I'll use them in contexts that I wouldn't have done before. And there's cabs which I had from before my Mesa cab obsession rabbit hole. Then now I'm like, oh, actually, that sounded really good. I just had this like obsession with why it wasn't sounding like this other thing.
Hmm.
Now that I know why it doesn't, it's like, cool, I can appreciate it as it is.
Got it.
So
Yeah.
yeah, I
Is
don't know.
that
It's probably is a bit obsessive, but yeah.
well? It just seems like more. Yeah, it seems like You're very detail oriented, and you like, I guess, enjoy going deep into those details where I wouldn't. But obviously, it pays off in so many ways. I mean, that plugin came out amazing, and your guitar tones are always great. Is it still kind of like a 5150 style that you go for on like a metal tone, like something like Periphery?
Uh, yeah, well, Periphery, I mean, like for this record, like I was saying, I very much rolled with what Misha wanted. And he's got a huge amp collection and he used different amps, combinations of amps on every song basically. And some of them he tracked with neural plugins. Like I don't know if mine was on there, but I think he used like the Omega plugin that they do. And there's a couple of songs where he reamped them, and then that's kind of what I was saying earlier, where we'd be listening and we'd end up using like the plugin sound because he'd kind of dialed it in a way that just sounded really like him, and
Mm.
the reamped one sounded maybe bigger and more like you associate with a real amp, but it didn't have the right vibe for it. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I guess to say a bit more about that kind of tone hunting thing, I think I'm very lucky, really, to be able to spend the time doing that and not operating a recording studio and having to record bands and learn on the job, as it were. I think that's
Mm.
always been my process, has been to try and learn not on the job, learn in the middle of the night and learn on my own time and just repeat, repeat, repeat. I think I'm quite bad at learning things on the fly, which
Hmm.
my wife is amazing at that. So I feel like an absolute dullard next to her when we're like in a new situation and she's got it all figured out. So I think something about my brain and being an only child is just used to kind of being able to sequester myself off and just drill something until I know it really well and then be able to come out and do it in the real world. So yeah,
Gotcha.
God, this really is like therapy, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, it makes a lot of sense. There's someone was asking. I was actually wondering the same thing. What those speakers are behind you, and I'm also curious what you think about like what speakers you mostly mix on, and what you think about like NS10 style monitors.
Um, I mean, well, okay, so the speakers behind me are made by Key Audio, called the Key 3. They're the only model that they offer. Um, Before that, I was using Adam monitors, and I was looking to get like just a kind of like forever set of speakers. And I was looking at things like the ATCs or the PMCs, like these amazing analog designs, which get used all over the world in amazing studios. The Amphions too, but maybe I wasn't quite so keen on those. And the Keys kept coming up as like this incredibly highly rated speaker, but I didn't like how they looked. I didn't like the fact that they're like really digital processing based. They're very DSP based. They've got speakers all around them and they basically cancel out frequencies behind. So they have a very directional low end. That's like the big thing,
Wow.
down to like 50 hertz. It's a cardioid pattern for the low end. So I can have them in this room, which is like a 4 meters by 4 meters spare bedroom in our house. And it's like the back wall isn't there. And although I've got lots and lots of treatment, the sound quality that I'm getting in terms of the directness um, is unlike anything I've heard before. So they also have like time aligned transients as well. So the transient information is incredibly clear, and the ability to kind of resolve low volume and high volume things simultaneously is amazing. So there's a sense of depth that's quite shocking when you first hear it. Like you can hear a delay trail bouncing around, minus 60 dB behind the vocal or whatever, and you can just pick
Mm.
stuff out in the mix. It's pretty awesome. I'm yet to have anyone dislike them, and that goes for mixers, musicians, non-musicians. Everyone tends to be pretty blown away by them. I'd like to think
I,
that a few people have gone on to buy them as a result of trying them in here. Certainly, I've seen them
okay.
cropping up more and more. As far as NS10s goes, I've never used them for any length of time. I've used them in studios. I I have nothing but respect for them, and I know that a huge amount of mixes that I like were done on them. I've never got past that initial hump of like this sounds really boxy and kind of
Yeah.
thwacky, and the thing which I
Sounds
don't
terrible the
get
first time.
actually, yeah, yeah, and like especially when you're on a session and you're engineering raw drums, which tend to be a kind of boxy sounding anyway, and like the cymbal bleed and the overheads are all gnarly sounding. It's not as polished sounding as a final mix. I just find like that's really difficult to listen to on NS10s, especially
Mm.
loud. Which I've been in the room with producers that have them cranked, and it's like I can't cope with it. But the thing which I find interesting is like you talk always about focusing on the mid range and how the NS10s make you concentrate on that mid range. I feel like at least until I got used to them, they'd make me turn down the mid range. You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like it'd
Yeah.
be so in my face that I'd be wanting to get rid of it. So I wonder what your thought is about that.
Yeah. I just had to listen to a lot of records on it. To I don't know. It's almost like completely reorienting like how how you hear things to get used to it. To the point where I agree that I wouldn't want to track with them on like a drum tracking session, cranking the NS. Like I'll rather have bigger speakers and crank those up. But I will always make the final decision on the NS10 just because I'm so used to them now. Like even if we're tracking, the studio's got to have a pair of those, so I can just listen to the snare and listen to the kick on those and be like, okay, I'm in the right ballpark, right? But I mean, it's interesting how you say about the detail that you're getting out of those key speakers, because for me, it's like I'm very interested to hear them, but I'd almost be like afraid of that, because to me, what makes the NS10s work so well is that they're so not super detailed that it helps me not obsess over things that don't really matter. And so I'd be worried if I had speakers that were so pristine and detailed like that, where I can hear the delay trail that's like 60 dB down, like you talked about. Like, I feel like I would just chase that stuff all day long and miss like the main point. So that isn't a
I mean,
factor
that
for
was
you?
exactly the worry that I had. That was
Mm.
exactly the worries that I had, and that other people that have gone on to buy them had those same worries going in. And I think they're just voiced in a way that's so pleasant to listen to, that that stuff is honestly just a joy to hear. And what I find is like
Mm.
I can just hear really clearly what I need to do. Like my worry was like my mixing's going to take ages, everything's going to sound rubbish, I'm going to be distracted.
Right.
And it's kind of the opposite. Like it's just like, oh, I need to do that. Cool, I'm going to do it. That's exactly the right amount to do it. So now I can move on to the next thing. But
Okay.
I think there is a point of comparison here, because I think the NS10s, and I don't know if it's just the fact they're usually used with huge power amps, or the lack of needing to or and being able to reproduce much bass content, but I feel like the transients are really highlighted on an NS10. Like they
Mm.
really knock you back, and it might also be the mid forwardness. And my theory is that I think the hardest thing about mixing drums is hearing the frequencies that occur in that split second of
Yeah.
an impact, and not being distracted, or not forgetting straight away when you hear the sustain of the drum, which has a completely different frequency rate, like content,
Mm.
if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
So I think that it could be that the NS10s are just giving you so much. They're making the transient so obvious that you're really making your EQ moves and compression moves based specifically on what's going on in that initial impulse of the drums,
Mm.
which is where it matters. Am I making any sense there? Like something which I've been doing recently, especially if I'm in studios I don't know, is I'll start EQing my snare drum or my kick drum with a transient designer afterwards with the sustain on 0. So it's literally just a blip
Huh.
in solo. Because the way I see it, that's like the tip of the iceberg that sticks out above the mix. The rest of the stuff tends to get submerged in the guitars, and it can be really difficult to kind of keep the memory of exactly what happened in the transient information if you're hearing the full sustain of it.
Yeah. I've
I don't
never
know.
really thought about it in that way, to be honest.
Hmm. I might be completely wrong about the NS10s at least, but the transient trick just sounds like your worst nightmare, like listening in solo and cutting out most of the information in the
Yeah.
signal.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I would, yeah, I wouldn't know how to make a decision there, but that's super interesting. Did you find that these speakers,
Hmm.
was there a time, like a learning curve getting used to how they translate outside, or was it kind of instant?
Um, no, translation was good. I found that I put more attention into transient information than I did previously. So I'm doing more stuff dynamics wise. So whether that's limiting and saturating or compressing to bring things forwards and back in the mix, as opposed to doing more EQing, which I tended to do more. So
Mm.
I'm still EQing loads, but for example, kick drum in periphery, I felt happy with how I was able to make it audible and impactful without adding loads of high end. And I think that's because of the resolution that I could hear.
Interesting.
And I think the only other thing would be the center channel is so clear here that things can be more tucked in volume and be perfectly audible. So it took me a while to get used to. I just pretty much as a habit would level the vocal and then put it up 1 dB before sending. Or same with lead
Hmm.
guitars. Like people are coming back like, oh, the vocal's a little bit quiet. And on my end, it's like, I can hear it so clearly, but yeah, fair enough on your system.
Yeah.
There's a lot of room coming into play or whatever. So,
Yeah.
but now that I don't really think about that.
Okay. Well, I'm intrigued now. I definitely want to hear them.
Yeah, I would be very interested to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. All right, where are we at here? Okay, we're gonna wrap this up soon, guys. Just scrolling through to see if we have any other good questions we can hit here. Um, Someone asked a question if you ever tried a 421 on the snare. I have not. I tried it on vocals once and it was awesome though. But that's made me think, Adam, do you like 421s on toms?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
be very careful. There's the two types of 421s as well. There's the twos and the originals, and people often talk about them interchangeably. But the original ones sound way more like an SM57. They've got like loads more mids and much less of
Mm,
that kind of abrasive thing that really comes out on guitars. So I mean, those on a snare could be cool, but because the pattern, I probably wouldn't use it. Probably get too much bleed. I could use it for
right.
sampling, I guess.
Okay.
421 2 on toms, I really like, and I use quite a lot actually.
Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I'm like, I've used them, but I don't really like them every time I use them. I don't know why they became the main thing, but it's interesting that you're a 421 guy.
Well, I think it's that plus a specific EQ couple of moves that you do on them,
Hmm.
that gives you a really specific sound.
Yeah.
And especially with how hard I compress my overheads, I'm realizing I get quite a lot of the stick attack from the overheads, which I didn't really think about too much. So in general, I think my tom EQ on the close mics has gotten darker actually over time, and 421 suit that quite well. What do you use?
Okay. I mean, I'll try anything on toms, but the ones that I stuck with at my studio were these little Sennheiser E604s. You know those ones?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Those are really good.
they can be clipped on or not, but yeah, they're just like when I kind of bought like a bunch of used studio gear from this guy and started renting the space when I started out, and those were like the dynamic mics he had. He had like four of those, and yeah, so I started with those, and then over the years I was like, well, I got to get 421s, so I got 421s, and then I tried condensers, but they kept getting broken by drummers, and then I just tried all manner of tom mics, and I just went back to those little 604s. I just they're great.
I mean, at the end of the day, you're going to cut loads of mids out of it anyway. Really, I feel like
Yeah,
toms you can get away with murder as long as the bleed isn't too bad.
yeah. All right, let me see if we got any other good questions here. Okay, so Marius is asking, how would you approach mixing properly programmed drums differently than real drums?
I think I would make it a point to try and mix them as similarly as possible.
Yeah.
I think one of the most important things I'd look at is make sure the velocities aren't programmed too hard,
Mm,
because I think that's one of the single biggest things that makes people's programs drums sound unrealistic. It's people just programming way too hard. I've sampled several kits on GGD ones. We've got one coming out in a couple of weeks' time where I did all the sampling as well. And the hard hits is like from all the way back here, putting loads and loads of effort into it. Yeah, you see drummers that hit like that sometimes, but nobody can play like a fill like that.
mm,
And even when people do that, it doesn't sound as good as someone that's playing a bit more controlled. Like look at Josh Freese or someone like him who's like an amazing rock session drummer. Look at how they hit. It's really accurately, it's firmly, but it's not destroying the drums or the cymbals, and the sound that comes out is really good. So keep
yeah.
your velocities down a bit and then treat them like real drums as much as possible.
Okay.
Is what I do.
Yeah, love that. All right, Rick has an interesting question here. How would you both cope with mixing purely electronic music? Would you be lost?
I've done a bit of that, and I've done some stuff for like a TV series, and like I love it, and it feels a bit like cheating, like because I don't have any of the methodology or the setup or anything like we're describing. It's like it's a completely random set of tracks that you just kind of go through and you just listen to it and be like, oh, it'd be cool if this had a bit more impact, or like, oh, that's a bit boxy, I'll just do that.
Hmm.
You send it back, and most of the time the response has been like, oh, that's great, and it's it's like, wow, that was it. I
Yeah.
should probably do this for a living because you get paid loads more. You know?
Yeah, that's
But the other
hilarious.
things I found, people are really sensitive. Like people are coming back with like 0.25 dB up on this lead vocal for these two words in a phrase. That the stuff that I did, which was for soundtrack, was incredibly detailed. Um,
Hmm.
but yeah, I enjoyed it. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I've done a little bit of stuff, but it's been a long time. Um, I would say I would find it a challenge probably for like the more extended low end content, in electronic music. Like that's just I don't even have a sub here. Um,
Hmm.
just for the metal and rock stuff that I typically mix, it's just obviously it's important, but it's not, I would say, as much of a focus as, some electronic stuff would be. So I'd probably be a little bit nervous about that. But I think the rest of it, I don't know. I could see myself typically when I'm mixing stuff with a lot of electronic and synths and virtual instruments, I'm making smaller moves and I'm just leaving stuff alone a lot more of the time because it's just different than, like you said, like having to mangle a tom track on a live drum kit or, the crazy processing that we can do on, you know, real instruments versus stuff that's already so processed and electronic. I almost have to fight against my instinct a little bit when there's a lot of those tracks where I'll just be like, okay, this string patch sounds fine. Like I don't need to do anything, and you just find the balance. So I don't know if I would struggle with it, but it'd be different for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure the specialists that would run rings around us, but I think so much of the success is just based on the sounds, like the sound design that you're given in the production and like the arrangement.
Sure.
And yeah, there's a lot less problem solving. Like the low end, yeah, it's good to hear it, but you're not dealing with lumpy low end most of the time. You're dealing with perfectly linear low end from a synth or something like that. So it's
Yeah.
like it's less problem solving and more leveling or enhancing.
Yeah. All right, let's hit one more question and then we'll wrap it up here. Connor's asking, let's say you're working in a mix for hours and deep into it. Do you ever come back to it later and it hits your ear wrong? Also, do you notice issues you hadn't heard when you were hours deep into it?
Yeah, but I don't know about you. It's quite rare for me to spend hours straight mixing something these days.
Hmm.
Partly because of having a young child, which I'm sure you can empathize with.
Yeah.
But yeah, I find I tend to mix in shorter bursts now. Like I'll mix for probably a maximum of 2 hours straight
Hmm.
um, before I'll go off and do something else. And I think maybe that's where this like kind of listening on another device just passively comes in as part of my process now.
Mm-hmm.
But for sure, yeah, if you mix for ages and you don't reference and you don't have a process that you tend to use, it's very easy to get lost. What about you?
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say that's definitely true. I would say I do mix for longer stints. Like I could definitely go start to almost finish in a mix in 5-6 hours and not really, or then a couple quick breaks here and there, not really stop. I think definitely there's something about stepping away though and then coming back because for me it's really just listening on something else. That's the thing that illuminates what's right or wrong. So for me it's my AirPods now. I'll just once I think the mix is pretty much done, I'll just throw it on my AirPods and maybe go for a walk or something. Um, and I'll instantly know like what's wrong and also what I've missed, what needs to be emphasized more. So yeah, definitely changing context and taking a break and coming back is super important. Sometimes it's almost not even noticing problems, it's noticing like, oh, this I just haven't made it exciting enough, or there's like this part that I thought had enough energy, but now that I'm hearing it again, or I'm hearing it on these different speakers, it needs more. Like it's almost like you get so in the weeds and then you back up. It's like, oh, you remember what's actually important about the song.
Yeah, one thing about AirPods, don't you find it makes guitars sound kind of really plasticky? Like, I never
Um,
like guitar sounds on AirPods.
I don't know. I kind of like how they sound overall. Yeah,
Fair enough.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I listen on AirPods too, but I think I'm always like, I have to reference to know if the guitars are good. So I tend to ignore the guitars when I'm listening on AirPods, more just like level or like,
mhm,
really obvious, too bloated or too kind of harsh or whatever.
yeah.
But yeah.
Well, guys, thanks for tuning in. Thank you so much, Adam, for hanging out for an hour and a half here. This was a lot of fun. Maybe we'll have to do it again sometime.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Cool.
I really enjoyed it. Thanks for listening to my therapy.
No, it's good. I mean, I literally like have things that I've written down that you've said in this conversation that I'm like, I'm gonna go and try that. So it's always a pleasure,
Oh,
man.
cool.
Yeah, I look forward to chatting again, and thanks everyone for tuning in. See you later.
Cool. Cheers, guys.